Number 90, Advantageous. Occasionally while browsing Netflix, you'll come across a movie you've never heard of with a vague but intriguing premise. More often than not, you'll pass for the time being, but with a mental note to come back to it at a later date, which never arrives. But if you're like me, you decide to watch it right then and there with the hopes of finding a hidden gem. But if the movie happened to be advantageous, you are most likely sorely disappointed. While there's nothing truly bad about this film, there's no single element of the production that elevates itself above the rest to make for essential viewing. It's an interesting story that poses questions about what the advance of technology and medical science means for humanity and our concept of self, but these ideas are only explored in the smallest and most intimate of ways, so when they fail to succeed, very little is left for the audience to dig into. If it had reached a little higher, this film could have at least been respected for ambition, if not admired for success. Overall, an inoffensive movie that plays it safe in its vision of the near future and leaves you wanting anything more. Number 89, Project Almanac. Putting Michael Bay's name on your movie will pretty much guarantee you two things. It will be seen, and it will be hated. While Michael Bay didn't direct this, it bears all the hallmarks of his oh-so-familiar money-making formula, taking something that's become popular, in this case found footage movies, and overdoing it to the point that it almost feels like parody, then using an idea that made another recent film successful, i.e. the genre mashup of found footage and superhero movie from Chronicle, and lastly, outright stealing of the story from a commercially unsuccessful film with a small cult following, Shane Carruth's Primer. But whereas Primer's faults lie in its lack of explanation of its complicated time travel plot, Project Almanac suffers from the opposite. Nearly every line of dialogue somehow exists only to try to make sense of what's happening on the screen. The characters are cardboard cutouts, the twists are predictable, and yes, the impossibly high-quality home video camera cinematography is nausea-inducing. This does make for a mildly entertaining what-if story, and it might actually be happy for the characters or feel bad for them when things start to go wrong if any of them were likable. As it stands, it's not a wholly uninteresting time travel film, but there's so much better out there. Number 88, Unfriended. Time and time again, we've seen horror movies about dumb teenagers getting killed off one by one. So if there's any new ground to be broken in this type of story, something truly inventive needs to enter the narrative. Found footage did this for a while, but eventually became formulaic in its own right. But the restrictions of found footage forced creativity, so restricting the format even further, to just the contents of a single computer screen, makes creating something worthwhile a daunting task. Unfriended largely rises to the occasion by keeping the story brief and briskly navigating the necessary exposition to get to the twists. I don't want to give away too much, but the story is basically the typical bullies get their comeuppance trope of horror movies past. This did leave me wanting something a little more, especially from the final twist. But the film's elevated by its style and manages some good scares. If you're in the mood for something creepy and a little different, this will serve as a satisfying diversion. Number 87, Mordecai. It's been a rough couple of years for Johnny Depp. Starring in several big-budget flops and some critically panned smaller projects, it just seems like he hasn't been able to find an identity as an actor that works for critics or audiences. And earlier this year, Depp took a few more licks for this movie, which is actually sort of unfair because most of what's wrong with Mordecai has nothing to do with Depp. Typecast as yet another quirky character who's meant to be endearing but comes off as annoying, he struggles to make any sense of this man he's playing and flounders without the watchful eyes of Tim Burton or Gore Verbinski. None of this is helped by a script full of long-winded dialogue that ultimately communicates nothing. The film earned some points, though, for having some normally dramatic actors take on comedy and deliver, in spite of the underwhelming jokes. Ewan McGregor's comic timing is excellent and gives me hope for future projects. And Paul Bettany, known for throwing himself into physical roles such as the Da Vinci Code, yikes, gets more laughs than either of the leads simply by reacting to repeated injuries. This feels like the dark before the dawn for Johnny Depp, and hopefully the day isn't too short. There are certainly better movies, but all things considered, this could have been a lot worse. Number 86, Hotel Transylvania 2. What's an Adam Sandler movie doing so high on my year-end list, you ask? Well, let me explain. Nothing that's good about this movie has anything to do with Adam Sandler. In fact, there's actually very little good about this movie. But what little there is really shines. Now, I wasn't a big fan of the first film. I thought the story was a little too generic and largely wasted a fantastic premise. And sadly, that's also the case this time around, too. There's a lot of backtracking in the first half of this film to create conflict that seems like it was addressed already. This outing is also plagued by pacing issues that left me unprepared for the climax and wanting more when it was over. But worst of all is the complete waste of a great character and a great voice actor. Grandpa Vlad, voiced by Mel Brooks, enters the story far too late and does far too little, which is really a shame because this is a strong creation from top to bottom. At this point, you're probably wondering what I do like about this movie, and that is the animation. The characters, the backgrounds, the speed, the movement, it's all so clearly a labor of love that deserves much better support than this. And nearly every laugh I got out of this movie was due to a visual gag, not an actual funny line. Come for the animation, don't expect to stay for any other reason. Number 85, Rock the Casbah. This film was absolutely raked over the coals by critics, and not without reason. Partially based on the true story of a Pashtun woman from Afghanistan who chose to perform on television in the face of persecution and ridicule, the movie places secondary importance on this side of the story, instead choosing to focus on Bill Murray's washed-up talent agent and his chance at redemption. Other similarly important cultural and political situations are trivialized in favor of Murray's misery, and while it's hard to look past these insensitivities, if you can, there are some things to like here. Murray's delusional character makes for a suitably detestable anti-hero. Danny McBride and Scott Conn provide some fun as the hilariously detached and opportunistic gun runners who hook Murray up with the similarly opportunistic, though decidedly more intense mercenary played by Bruce Willis. Populated by absurd screwball comedy with surprisingly few consequences, the moments of tension are undercut by a sense that this is all some sort of dreamlike state from which we might be roused at any moment. I would have liked to see this story get the respect it deserves, and that the rest had been turned into something completely different, because it's occasionally very funny. Fans of Bill Murray and Barry Sonnenfeld will probably enjoy this somewhat, but if you're not a fan of either, you can take the critics' advice. Number 84, Terminator Genisys. I love time travel movies. The mere concept of being able to travel through time is so fascinating with all the possibilities it creates and all the ways it could go wrong. But the pros and cons of time travel movies are similar to those of movies about it. You can do almost anything with the premise, but if you're not careful, it can turn into a gigantic mess, only there's no going back to change it. Which brings us to this film. No, I did see a worse time travel movie this year, but I did also see a better one. The biggest problem with this one, though, is that even though the story could have gone literally anywhere, instead it retreads well-covered ground with one too many winks at the audience, in an attempt to mine some nostalgic affection from the series' fans. And this is really frustrating because there are a lot of cool new ideas here, but most of those are either half-baked, completely unexplored, or were spoiled by the trailer. I wanted to like this movie, but there simply aren't enough positives to make this a candidate for guilty pleasure status. The action is run-of-the-mill, the direction is uninspired, and the actors are powerless against this thanks to a messy, exposition-heavy script. If you're a big fan of the Terminator movies, this will likely leave you cold, and non-fans will probably be underwhelmed. In a word, disappointing. Number 83, Maze Runner: The Scorch Trials. There were so many dystopian future young adult novel series film adaptations in theaters this year that the jokes practically write themselves, but one of the most important hallmarks of these stories is the main character being kept in the dark about their importance to the powers that be. This can be a very effective tool for creating a sense of adventure and keeping the audience engaged, but this technique also runs the risk of alienating those who haven't read the books or anyone who struggles to remember details from the previous films. And sadly, The Scorch Trials finds itself trapped in this dilemma as it chooses to plunge forward into new plot developments instead of the alternative of rehashing things we've already seen, which may or may not have helped. Instead, incomprehensible story devices lead to action set pieces that are robbed of tension. The danger barely registers because we have no idea what's really at stake. On the positive side, the action is well staged, if occasionally subject to certain overused genre tropes. The performances are serviceable from the young leads and mostly quite good from the veterans involved, especially Alan Tudyk, who gets one scene when I gladly would have watched an entire movie about his character. Fans of the book should proceed with caution, and those who like the first movie might like this, but could be forgiven for deciding not to go any further with this series. All others can go about their lives knowing they haven't missed much. 82, Burnt. Being nominated for an Oscar in 3 consecutive years would probably be a big confidence boost, but in Bradley Cooper's case, having 3 critical and commercial bombs in the same year might even things out a little. While this is nowhere near as much of a mess as Serena or Aloha, Burnt still feels like something that should have been better given its unique setting and talented cast, and most of the positives that this movie has to offer come from the acting. Sienna Miller makes it look effortless as a beleaguered single mother and foil to Cooper, Uma Thurman gives surprising life to what amounts to little more than a cameo as a food critic, and oddly wedged into this film is an underutilized Alicia Vikander, who, as opposed to Cooper, has been in a slew of great movies this year. But no amount of talent can save this movie from its fatal flaw: poor structure. Supposedly a story of redemption for a disgraced man, the whole thing feels like the middle and end of a great narrative that starts with the fall of a hot-headed, drug-addled chef, which sounds like an amazing movie. Instead, the film starts with a protagonist who already has 2 years of sobriety and a renewed sense of determination, and its lowest points in the film seem like a vacation compared to the checkered past that's heavily hinted at. Largely predictable and bland, there's not much reason to see it outside of satisfying a few culinary curiosities. Number 81, Concussion. Look, it's no secret that plenty of movies only get made because the producers see the possibility of award nominations and the prestige that comes with them, and it's no mystery why actors and directors would want to work on these projects. But I think this creates an interesting comparison to unnecessary sequels. Those films are made because they're expected to be an easy way to make money, but substitute Oscars for money and you find yourself in a similar situation. People making movies for the wrong reasons, thinking only about how they might benefit from it instead of how it might benefit the audience. Now, this is not to say that the only reason to make a film is purely for the sake of art. It's perfectly fine to just make entertainment, but entertaining movies are still made for the viewer. Concussion is a thrown-together showcase for Will Smith's performance, which is very good, But all the signs of Oscar bait are there. The showy, simile-laden dialogue, the hot-button topic, which is actually cooled considerably, and is there a scene of the protagonist breaking something and crying while sappy music plays? You bet there is. Both Smith and co-star Gugu Mbatha Raw give performances deserving of nominations, or at least a better movie. The potential existed here to tell an important story, but it just ends up feeling preachy and self-righteous, which is a great disservice to its real-life subjects. Not many reasons to see this outside of awards prognostication.